Good evening. It's good to see everyone. We're going to hold up just a couple minutes more because I am waiting on a few folks. But it is good to see everyone. And Kimberly and Mom, y'all were both on this morning, so it's good to see you again. You guys should get to know each other. Kimberly probably feels like she knows my mother.
Wait, are you Lauren's mom? It's so nice to meet you. We love her.
Well, thank you. I do too.
Maybe more than we do.
It's possible. Yeah, I have to come to this to make sure she doesn't talk about me with.
I always get permission first.
No, she knows I know that I made a lot of mistakes and I'm down with it.
Oh, goodness.
We also love your grandchildren.
Oh, thank you.
That's very true. That's very true.
Yeah, y'all get to see them a lot more than I do, but.
Well, none of us are seeing our grandchildren at the moment.
Does.
I know.
Howdy, so we're back in our regular place.
It's so good to see you.
Lauren has never seen us in this place. This is the place where we sit for old-fashioned Sunday school.
Okay. Yeah, usually I see Kimberly in a different space for Bible study, and then I saw her in another different space this morning. So.
Yes. Well, we have.
And Liz, I've seen you do stories from where you are right today.
So, Lauren?
Yeah.
Did you were recording this morning?
I did record this morning, yeah.
Good.
Awesome. I'm hoping I reached out to all three of our kids. They were all interested. They were all a little challenged with kids' schedules and things, but I said that you were recording and that I hoped that I would be able to make it available to them, but they might pop in tonight. You never know.
Yeah, well, that's why we're doing this 8 p.m. slot, because we know that a lot of people with younger children are trying to get their kids down for bed right now. So, people might join halfway through because that's what 8 p.m. looks like in our world. So, but I think I will go ahead and get us started just because I felt like this morning I was running out of time towards the end and I didn't. So I'll try to pace it a little better this afternoon.
Okay.
So full disclaimer, everyone, we are recording now.
We are. Mm-hmm. So we'll see which one of these comes out better and maybe we'll put it on the podcast. But let's open up in prayer, and I'm going to use a prayer from our prayer book. It's a prayer for the human family, and if you've been watching the midday meditations, this is the prayer, the collect that I use almost every afternoon for those. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. That in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So that's on page 815 of the Book of Common Prayer. These old books have some great prayers that feel modern, but they're not. All right. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can share slides with you. But if we do end up putting this on a podcast, then the folks that are listening can know that there's really nothing that exciting to see. It's just to kind of give our conversation a little bit more structure. There we go. All right. So this class is all about talking to our kids about race. And one of the reasons that I felt like it would be helpful to teach this class, and when I say teach, I mean learn alongside you, is because this has been a conversation in our family that has been exciting in some ways because it's fun to be learning alongside our kids, but also scary in others because we just are pretty confident that we're not always doing the right thing. So this is a picture of a moment earlier this summer, my two kids, this is about a week after the rioting started in Atlanta. And we had traveled to Virginia right after those riots had begun, or protest, I should say. And it was really hard to leave in that moment because we, on the one hand, I mean, I was talking to Lisa, who's in this class, and she was like, we were talking about how there's a sense of relief that we were leaving all of the anxiety behind, and we were going to this, lovely place up in the mountains where I grew up. And on the other hand, I felt like I was turning my back on my community at a really poignant moment in time. But when we got to Lexington, we learned that that the town I grew up in was going to be having a nonviolent demonstration gathering organized by several of the Black families in town. And so we talked to the kids the night before on Friday night about what it meant to show up for our friends. And we talked about the fact that that there are people in the world that don't feel like Black people are valued the same way white people are. And that was a really difficult conversation to have. We tried to have it with baby dolls that we have, a Black baby doll named Kathy, after Kathy Zappa, Lucy Ray's favorite baby doll, and a white baby doll named Alice that was a gift and that we also love and cherish. And so we talked about how some people in the world felt like baby Kathy was not to be valued the same way that baby Alice was, or that not everybody in the world treated babies like baby Kathy the same way people treated baby Alice. And Charlie was like, but these babies are just dolls, they're not real. So like here we were trying to have this really meaningful moment, and we were already struck by the fact that we were coming up short. But the next morning we gave them the option of coming with us to the gathering, and they wanted to go with us, and they chose the words for their own sign. So Lucy Ray's sign says Black Babies Matter, and that was her sign, thinking of her very favorite baby doll Kathy. And Charlie's sign says, the more we get together, the happier we'll be, which is his favorite rappy song. And so we went together, and anytime they couldn't take it all in, but anytime people were clapping or really responding to the speaker, the kids would just stand up in silence and hold up their signs. And it was almost like a solemn moment. So they understood, there seemed to be a sense of the gravity of the moment, even if they couldn't understand everything that was going on. So we started reading this book, Raising White Kids, which had been on my bookshelf for several years because Jennifer Harvey is not only a great writer, but also a great speaker and a great professor. And I got to see her at Emory University in Candler's School of Theology. And and listening to her talk, I just took copious notes the whole time. I was so inspired by her teaching. And so she has this book, Raising White Kids, that I bought thinking, oh, this could be a great book for us to talk about at the cathedral. And then I decided it just didn't feel like the right time. I felt like maybe 3 people would show up if we had that conversation. And now it really feels like the right time. And so despite the fact that I'm going on vacation next week, and we're talking about it now because it's the right time. Dr. Harvey went to Union Theological Seminary in New York, where I had the pleasure of taking a few classes. And it's a much more diverse seminary than I attended. And so she grew up in a diverse area. She studied in a diverse area. She is a rooted and grounded Christian who practices her faith. And she actually has this other book out too. She's got a number of books, but this one's called Dear White Christians. And so this is a topic she takes up in lots of different spaces. So what I've done for these slides is just to put the title of the chapter and then the takeaways that she lists at the end of each chapter. So everything on these slides is actually taken from the book. And if you do much on social media, if you read people's posts and you come to the end of there's a really long post, and at the beginning they just highlight is that we are still in this moment, a long moment of racial injustice in our country. And I just got to notice that my internet connection is not great. So if I get frozen, I'll come back. But we've been in this moment of racial injustice for a really long time, despite really well-intentioned teachers, our parents and other influencers who have wanted to make sure that we do not grow up being racist ourselves. And yet we still are up against some of these same injustices that they faced when they were children. And a lot of that comes from the fact that the teaching that we have received and the teaching that we have been using comes up short. It's she says, if the tried and true hasn't worked, then it's time for something new. And so that's what this book is about, is if the tried and true hasn't worked, then it's time for something new. And she talks about what it's like being a college professor at Drake University and teaching about race, and how she'll have a classroom full of white students, Black students, other students of color. And when she announces that they're going to start a unit on race, the students of color are ready to show up. They know how to talk about this. They've been talking about it their whole lives. But the white students look like deer in the headlights and don't even know where to start. And it's not really their fault, you know. Here they are, young adults, and they are having to have this conversation for the first time, and they're not really sure how to have it because they've grown up learning either that we're not supposed to see race, or that we're not supposed to talk about it, or when they've tried to talk about it, they've been silenced and they've learned that it's a taboo subject, and that really makes it hard for them to enter into a conversation. And I think that that's true in the workplace too, not just in college classrooms, but I can think of times when somebody will bring something up and you might notice or that it's inappropriate or racist, but you know that that person didn't mean it that way, and so you don't address it. And then your Black colleague or peer could be really highly offended by the fact that nobody's saying anything, nobody's addressing it, that it's just kind of going unnoticed. And so, but most of the time, if we don't say something, it's because we simply don't know what to say. It's not because we don't care. It's just because we don't know what to say, because we have not been raised to know what to say. So she has a couple of quotes at the beginning in the introduction that from parents that I wanted to share with you. The first one says, "I worry about what to say to my second grader about racism. He has lots of Black friends. I don't want him to start to treat them as being somehow different. I also don't want to say something to him about racism that he then repeats to his friends in a way that hurts them." And so we were talking about this, a group of parents, just the other night, about one of the moms had taught her son what the N-word is and what it means and why it's painful. And she did that because it's an important lesson, but now she is petrified that he's going to turn around and use that word at school. And so the fear of teaching your children something and then them somehow misusing it or using it out of context in a way that makes it seem as if they're intending it in a way for harm when they're really not. Another parent said, "I don't want to lie to my kids about the United States, but how do I talk about its violent history, such as what slavery or treatment of Native Americans was like? I don't even let my kids watch violent TV." So that resonates with me because as a parent of a 3 and a 5-year-old, we're not watching violent TV either. And when we went to Richmond several weeks ago to see the Robert E. Lee Memorial, realizing that it was going to be coming down soon, and it felt a lot like seeing the Berlin Wall before it comes down. I mean, not that I saw the Berlin Wall, but I can imagine. And we were trying to figure out, how do we explain why this monument is really painful for some people to look at? And so we started talking about slavery, and I was like, how am I going to explain slavery to the kids? And instantly Charlie was like, "Oh, you mean like Pharaoh?" And I was so grateful for our godly play teachers. And I was so grateful for Charlie's education at Ahava, where the Jewish school that he attends, because he had a context to place this in. And so we were like, yeah, like how would it make the Jewish people feel to see a statue of Pharaoh up in the middle of their town all the time. And he just got really serious and said, sad. And so I was grateful that our Bible stories actually provide some of that framework, because there's some violence in the Bible, and we do talk about it at church. And so our kids, they have that context even if we don't realize it. And then another parent says, I've gone out of my way to put my kids in diverse situations their entire lives. And yet the older they've gotten, the wider their friend group seems to get. I don't really know what's going on, let alone what to do about it. And this quote speaks to something that we'll be talking about tonight, which is just that as much as we want to value diversity, that's only getting halfway there. That we can't just put our kids in diverse situations and hope that they're going to pick up on how to be racially conscious people. We actually have to give them the language and the structure to be able to make sense of the diverse spaces that we are entering into with them, or just dropping them off into. So that's kind of an overview of some of the things that we'll be talking about over the next couple of weeks. So the first chapter, she talks about moving from color blindness to race consciousness parenting. And I think that this is really, she spends quite a bit of time on this, and I think it's important too, because I mean, while I can only see a few faces on the screen right now because I'm sharing my slides, I imagine that most of us have grown up with this color blindness teaching, or taught it ourselves, right? Because it is this really popular idea that came about after the civil rights movement, the idea that we shouldn't notice race because we're all the same under our skin. I 100% remember learning that peel back the skin and we're all the same. And that's true, but it's true partly because race isn't just about skin color. Race is a social construction. And it's true that we're not all the same because we don't live in an equitable society. So it's not an idea that's meant to do anybody any harm. And the intentions of people teaching color blindness are good. They're good people teaching what they think is good teaching. But it has failed us as a country and as a people, and we can do better. We have better information, and so we can do better with it. And at the end of the day, we do see race. So being colorblind is just not a thing. We do see race, and our children see race. They see it at a very early age. And so it's not helpful to tell children not to notice what they do notice. That just brings about cognitive dissonance and makes them feel confused and like they're doing something wrong. So when I say that race is a social construction, what Dr. Harvey says is that this means that differences such as skin tone, hair texture, shapes of faces, and so on don't have any significance or meaning in and of themselves. So she uses the example of churches and about how different groups of people that worship together are. And I think that we all are familiar with the idea that Sunday mornings are like the most segregated hour of the week in the United States. So she says, imagine how different the space of a predominantly white church, like the Cathedral of St. Philip, a historically Black church, or a church made up of Latino-Latina citizens or recent immigrants from Mexico feels when one enters each of these respective spaces. And it's true. If you come to the Cathedral of St. Philip and you come to Michael Chapel at 11:15 in non-COVID times, you will find the chapel full of our Latinx community. And what makes that space feel different and what makes that worship feel different is not the fact that the people gathered have brown skin or speaking Spanish. It's the fact that we have to do the passing of the peace for a solid 10 minutes because everybody has to shake everybody's hand. It's the fact that there's that we sing the Lord's Prayer to the song of, the Sound of Silence, Simon and Garfunkel. It's just a very different vibe because the social construct is different and the culture that's represented is different. So that's the social construct piece, but there are, of course, physical differences as well. And children as young as 6 months notice these physical differences, notice these racial physical differences. And as early as age 5, children can notice that different groups are treated differently. And anyone who has or has had a 5-year-old that is obsessed with the concept of fairness, but it's not fair, understands this developmental stage of comparing and realizing that different groups are treated differently. So I'm going to pause for a second and drink a sip of my water to see if anybody has any thoughts or questions.
Well, I mean, I'll share just to get some talking started that, I mean, can't remember, like, I became aware of how aware my girls were, who, for those who don't know, they're almost 7 and 4. Like, I think my eldest was like 3-ish when we were at a restaurant and there was a Black waitress and she asked me if she was a teacher, because the 2 daycares she'd been at were about 95% the teachers were Black. And that just, you know, made me realize how outside of her school, everywhere we go, including the cathedral, is very white. And just being aware that she was able to recognize those differences and even patterns within those differences. And so, you know, I honestly can't remember how I responded at the time. I knew it was an important moment I needed to respond to very smartly, but I wish I could remember how I responded, but I definitely remember just being a little lost for words for a moment, because you know, it's like maybe you do worse by not saying anything because you're so afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just thought it was just so interesting how young she was and had recognized that pattern.
Yeah. And that's, I told the story this morning about how Lucy Ray, who's 3, she noticed about 6 months ago, I guess, when she was 2, I think it was around when she was 2.5, after the 11:15 service, she saw all of the Latinx community gathering in the hallway. And as we were walking past, she was like, "Mommy, are you not going to say abba-dibba-dibba-doo?" Because she doesn't speak any Spanish, but she was just trying to like make foreign sounds, because she knows that whenever I see brown people at church, I speak Spanish because I'm a part of that congregation. I'm there every other Sunday, and I have relationships with everybody. So we just start talking in Spanish. And I was kind of, I went to school the next day and asked her teacher about it. I was like, how do I talk to my child about this? Because on the one hand, I'm glad that she's making these observations. And on the other hand, I'm worried that she's going to put, you know, brown people, in this case, Latinx people, into a certain category, that she's just going to assume that every time she sees a brown person, that they speak Spanish. And is it okay that she's noticing that, or am I doing something wrong? And so it is, our kids are noticing things that they can't even always put words to. And so that's why it's so important for us to give them the framework to be able to continue to explore the things that they're noticing, because they are noticing them. All right, so children noticing racial differences, that's just natural. And Dr. Harvey says, if we don't interpret the meaning of these differences with and for them, society will. And really, I think even when we do interpret these things with and for our children, we're doing so alongside society, because we're not the only voice in their lives. So we can't remove our kids from society, and the influence is always there, which is why it is so early to start, or so important to start early and often. She makes this point that it's important not to assume that if a child says something racist, that they have racist parents. And she gives the example of her mother being a doctor and somebody saying, what do you want to be when you grow up? Do you want to be a doctor like your mom? And she's like, women can't be doctors, even though her mom was a doctor. And so there, you've got society's social, influence going on at the same time that you have your family's social influence. So it's important to talk about things early and often. And don't assume that if someone says something racist, that their child is racist. And don't assume that if you are anti-racist, that your kids are also going to always say things anti-racist. They might, your kids growing up in your home, even if it's an anti-racist home, could say something racist. And, or maybe we should say will say something racist at some point in time. And that's why it's so important to make our voices heard again and again, because there are so many voices in the world that our kids are hearing, and so many influences in the world that our kids are, what's the word I'm thinking of? I don't know, like sponges, that they're just receiving all of this information. So it's important that we engage conversation rather than just hoping that our kids are going to somehow pick up on our values by watching us. It's important for us to live out our values, but it's also important for us to talk about them in an explicit and intentional way. One of the most powerful perpetrators of racism is silence, and not just in the sense that silence is violence, which is true, but also when we don't talk about something or when we try to shut a conversation down, we communicate the idea that a certain topic is taboo. And I reached out to one of our parishioners, one of our well-loved parishioners, Miss Brenda, to ask if I could use her as an example. So Miss Brenda had cancer and had chemo treatments, and she, as a result of that, is overweight and uses a scooter to get around and is a lot less mobile than she would be otherwise. And she teaches our children music. She leads our little choristers. And so everybody, all of the children love Miss Brenda, my children included. And I get really nervous that my kids are going to ask Miss Brenda something that is inappropriate or offensive about why she can't walk very well, or, as I've heard Charlie say to her before, why are your knees so big? And I just turn all the shades of red, so embarrassed that my child is going to say something that could hurt her feelings. And yet, by trying to shut the conversation down and saying, shh, don't talk about that, it communicates to my children that there's something wrong with Miss Brenda, when there's nothing wrong with Miss Brenda, or that they shouldn't be noticing the fact that she's different, when it's completely developmentally appropriate for them to notice that she's different. And if anybody can respond to those questions, it's Miss Brenda. She's really good at fielding those questions. And I asked her, would you prefer that a child engage you and ask you impolite questions, or would you prefer that their parents silence them? And she said, of course, I would rather that the child ask me questions, because then I can give them an answer and I can tell them my story. So it's important that we don't communicate to our kids that certain topics are taboo, which is what we do if we try to shut the conversation down because it's not polite. Any thoughts about that, especially since that's an example that might hit closer to home for folks in this call?
Lauren, it's Nancy Bean. I was reading a book. I think it was The Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. And she talks about how this child was in the grocery store and saw a black child or a black person and said, why is his skin so dirty? And the mom quickly shushed him and said, no. And she said, how much better it would have been had said, no, you see, your skin is this color and his skin is just darker. And there are all sorts of people that have different colors of skin.
Right.
But in the middle of it, because she was so embarrassed, she quickly got him to be quiet. So that speaks to exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's, that communicates one thing to the child, right? That the difference is bad, or that, that the skin color is bad. And it also communicates something to the person that could have overheard the conversation. Instead of them seeing you address the, skin color, they're seeing you try to, make it a taboo thing. And so it's not good for the child or for the person that might have overheard the conversation.
So Lauren, I had an experience like that with Jack when he was probably about Lucy Ray's age, and that's how he would just identify people as how they looked, if they had blonde hair or yellow hair or orange hair. And we were at the grocery store, and he wanted to go ask someone something, and I was like, well, they're right there. And he said very loudly, do you mean the black man? And I was just kind of like, and then but the man turned around and he goes, but I am black, of course. And he goes, that's me. And so it diffused the situation, and it was just honest, and he recognized that Jack was just saying, it's like saying, hey, the man with the blue shirt, or, and so, and we had always said, focus on the clothes, focus on, and then he was like, no, I'm black. But it was kind of a nice, sweet moment.
Yeah. And
Awkward.
that is, that's so, I want to say like age 3 to 5, children are really categorizing. That's part of how they are learning developmentally is, there's shapes and there's colors and there's everything is all about categories. And so, of course, they're going to do that, and that we should affirm that. So she, Dr. Harvey says that race and racism matter in the lives of children of color. And I think this is really important. She talks about how the recognition for children of color happens early. And when we fail to offer white children that same recognition, we fail to honor what children of color are up against. We create this false dichotomy that children of color need to recognize race and white children don't. So she says that not talking about color and practicing color blindness and making color taboo communicates that color is shameful, and that there's something wrong with it. Again, I really don't think that this is the intent of people that teach color blindness. And if you have taught color blindness, this is not a condemnation of you having taught that before. We have done the best that we have with the information that we have. But now we have better information, so we can do better. And doing better is race-conscious parenting. It's noticing and naming race early and often. Noticing and naming race early and often. And so she does actually, Nancy, give an example of a parent in a grocery store, which is funny because my mom is on this call and she has an example like this of me. But she gives the example of a 3-year-old shopping with her dad and pointing out and saying, look at that brown skin, and the father quickly shushing the child and whisking her away from the encounter. So shushing the child communicates that there's something wrong with brown skin, and the child is making a developmentally appropriate observation. So instead, it's better to affirm the noticing and to say something like, honey, it's not polite to point at people, but yes, that woman's skin is a beautiful shade of brown. So we can still teach our kids, don't point. We can still work on that politeness measure that we want to work on, but to not make the teaching about color or skin or difference, any kind of difference, but instead just that pointing is not nice. That's a really hard lesson to learn. We're in the middle of that right now. It's hard. Note that race-conscious parenting extends beyond celebrating diversity. So we touched on this in the introduction, that just valuing diversity doesn't give our kids the tools that they need. And if we truly lived in a diverse and equitable society, it would be enough. But because we don't, it only gets us halfway there. So as an example, and this is a kind of sticky example, I've always taught my kids that police officers are helpers, and to look for the helpers, right? That if they need something, that they should feel comfortable approaching a police officer. Now, my friends with Black children have to teach their kids something different. They teach their kids to keep if they're approached by a police officer, to keep their hands visible and to keep their voices calm. And they are not always able to say the same things to their kids that I'm able to say about police officers. So that speaks to the difference, the fact that we don't live in an equitable society, the fact that people with Black skin are treated differently than people with white skin. And we know that difference exists, and so we have to teach to it. So now I am trying to teach my kids that good and bad people can have all kinds of jobs, and that mean people can be police officers, just like they can be teachers, or even clergy, that mean people can have all different kinds of jobs, and most people are good. Most people are good, but that we know not everyone is. And if we see somebody doing something mean, that we need to tell the truth about it, and that we show up for people being mistreated. Because if my Black friend can't teach her child that all police are good, then I can't either. And that's really hard. Does anybody have any response to that?
Jackson, no, a friend of mine told me that her high schooler was told in health, it was taught by a Black coach. If you are pulled over, keep your hands on the wheel, give him your name and address, and say, I want a lawyer. And I was like, hey, Jackson, is that what you were told in health? And he's like, yeah, I don't think so. And he did take health online through the Georgia Virtual School, but it was a completely different experience.
Yeah.
I definitely think this is a hard one. Well, I mean, all of this is hard, particularly thinking about age appropriate and, wanting to get that balance right of all the different considerations. But like the police factor is hard. Like I grew up, not surprisingly, always told that police are there to help you. And so, at one point I realized that I hadn't really talked to my kids about that. And that was something important I wanted them to understand, because I just would hate to think that they were lost in the middle of a store, and instead of looking for someone who could help them, they just stood there waiting, and, worst case scenario, someone grabbed them. I don't know. That's where anyway, point being, like, I want my girls to see police officers as people who are there to help them. And I'm not naive to the fact that there are probably police officers who might do even my girls wrong. And I don't want them to be in the dark about the racism and systematic racism in the police force. But I mean, at the ages of 6 and 4, I feel like I'm okay staying in the helper realm and can bring out the darker side when they're older. But, I don't know. It's like the reading I've been doing, like hearing this, I haven't read this book, and this other book I've been reading, I feel like everyone thinks saying what you should and shouldn't do, and nothing yet I've seen is saying, like, well, what are the words I should use? Like, I know I shouldn't teach color blindness, but what do I say when my kid asks me about, why their Black friend was taught something different about the police? Like, what is okay to, I want a manual that says what to say and not just general guidelines.
So this book is one written by 3 women that live here in Atlanta. And I actually, I spoke with one of them on Friday about the possibility of them coming and speaking to our class, but decided that we already had so much content, and they're actually pretty busy fielding calls right now, that we're going to do an event with them in the fall. But this book is called Something Happened in Our Town. And it's by Marianne Solano, Marietta Collins, and Ann Hazard. And a parishioner and gave this to me a couple of weeks ago because she knows the authors. And it's helpful because it basically, it doesn't straight up say what happened, but you can tell that somebody, that there was some police violence. And so there's a white child that's talking to her family. And it does say that, why did the police shoot that man? And the mom says it was a mistake. I feel sad for the man and his family. And then the dad says, yes, the police thought he had a gun. And then her sister, who is clearly not impressed with the conversation, says, the cop shot him because he was Black. And it goes through this white family having this conversation with their child. And then it moves to the neighbor's house. There she is, there's the neighbor. And the neighbor having the same conversation, a Black boy, with his family about the same thing.
Oh, you're frozen again.
Goes through, and there's a new kid that comes to their class, and both kids have learned something from their families about how we stand up for people. And so when this person is being left out, they decide that they're going to change the narrative, and that they're going to be the one to make sure that this new person in their class has a place. And one of the things that's helpful about it is in the back, there's an 8-page note to parents. And it has all different kinds of general guidelines, unique issues for African-American families, how to address racial bias with children, vocabulary and words and child-friendly definitions, sample parent-child questions and answers. So it's, I think, a really helpful book, one that it's geared towards ages 4 and up, I think, but our 3-year-old we've read it to her, but she also flips through the pages herself at night. Our kids like to pretend they're reading at night. And I guess they are reading. You read pictures before you read words, but, and she will point things out like, why is his face so angry? Or why is that person being mean? And different things, you know, she's engaging it in a way that's age appropriate for her. So there are, you know, and I'm going to try to bring different books every week, but there are books that kind of, there are people out there in the world that know how to talk about this to children, and they write books, and we can read those books to our children, and by reading them, learn how to talk about these things with our children. So I think it's helpful to look for some of those.
Lauren, what was the name of it again?
The name of the book is Something Happened in Our Town. Okay. And usually we carry it at the Cathedral Bookstore. They are out of it right now because, but they should probably have more copies by the end of the month. Because I know that it's already gone to print, I think twice now since everything kind of hit the fan this summer. But you can get copies immediately if you go to Imagination Press. It's like imagination without the I, Imagination Press, and that, and I think that they have copies available now.
Can I jump in with one quick thing?
Yes, please.
So I was going to say before, there's a wonderful book that actually I was given when our eldest, Ella, was born, and it was from one of my colleagues who raised her children in the kind of early 80s, and it was a book called People, and I've given it back to her so she can read it to her grandchildren, but I'll see if I can find the title, and I'll send it to my parents so that they can send it to you.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful book. So it was literally just entitled People, and it talked all about a lot of the different things that you're talking about. So it's like, you know, people have all different size noses, and some people are tall and some people are short, and some people have dark skin and some people have light skin. And it really talked about the way people dress differently.
Yes, I think I grew up with that book.
It's a wonderful book.
Yes.
And so especially being in DC, it was really helpful because we have a very international culture. And so it really put in context some of the specific outfits that people wore, especially on different occasions. And it just kind of put it in this broad context of differences. The only other thing I was going to say, sitting next to a 14-year-old, is this sense of growing with your child in these discussions, as we are all growing too, right? We're all trying to learn. But gosh, when Ella was 4, police officers are helpful. And I think it's really great if a kid gets lost to be able to say, like, you look for someone with children or a police officer or something like that. But now, you know, some of the books that Ella's reading, I don't know if you can share 2 of the titles. You know,
it was The Hate You Give. And there's one I'm about to read. It's called Dear Martin. And it's a similar kind of story.
Yeah.
So it just really hammers home this idea of the age-appropriate discussions, and, you know, that the kids bring based on their interactions in society and what they see online or what they hear about from their friends or what they're actually reading. It's just a totally different ballgame over time, and even very different for a 14-year-old than an 11-year-old. And so I'm very much celebrating all of your comments about age appropriateness and thinking about how my life has changed in the last decade from police officers are helpful to, you know, Ella reading The Hate You Give.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for that. I think one of the things that I've learned too that's been helping me is I've been constantly nervous about if I'm sharing too much or not enough, is that, and this was a child psychologist that told me this, that your children will take in what they're ready to take in. And so even if you say too much, they're not going to take all of that. I mean, there is such a thing as saying too much, and we do have to be mindful, and we do have to be careful, but we don't have to be so mindful and careful that we paralyze ourselves with fear. because our children will take in what they're ready to take in, and then they'll pick up the other pieces as they're ready to.
So, Lauren, two quick thoughts.
Yeah.
And I love what this represents. The implication is that when we can tell our kids that the role of a police officer is to be a helper, but not all police officers are good people, and you'll find not good people, as you said before, in all professions or all potential interaction. That implication is that there's a critical thinking component to the child, or for the adult for that matter, to be able to assess the situation they're in and be able to make a determination of what kind of person am I actually facing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a conversation that I think is maybe the next level of this consciousness, but I think it is equally as important, if not more so, because it'll give us the tools to actually move ahead.
Yeah.
Move in the right direction. And the only other comment I was going to make is we need the book Raising White Adults.
Yes. Well, thank you, Buzz. One of the things I appreciate about this book is because so many of us did learn, this color blindness schema. It's helpful to be able to read this book about how to teach your kids something different because you are learning in the process. And so I feel like whether you have kids or not, this book is so helpful in creating that context and that framework for adults and children alike. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Buzz. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's going to be our children teaching us because we're going to be learning for the sake of our children, right? So looking at
judging by who you have on there, that's already happening.
So yeah, good point. So chapter 2, she's like, okay, so we've established that color blindness is not helpful, that we need to instead move towards a race conscious parenting. Where do I start? And so if we've all been raised in this age of color blindness, how do we even know how to be different ourselves before teaching our children differently? And she says, quote, as with any skill set, we only learn to do it and get better at it. And in that process, develop even clearer insights into how to do it well through practice. It's through practice. And so, I think that one of the things that's helpful is to, like if you find like that this book or another book like it is helpful, to discuss it with your group of friends and practice by talking to your friends so that then you can have that conversation with your kids. And it won't be like you can use your friends as guinea pigs if you want to start. But it's never too early to start. And I compare it to, I don't know if y'all have ever had this experience, but, trying to figure out when's the right time to start a family. When we had this, we were living in New York and we were, Jay and I were having this lovely childless life where we could just really focus on our careers and eat out all the time and, just love New York. And it was great. And then one day we were like, even if we're not ready to have kids now, 10 years from now, we're going to really wish we had kids. So we finally just had to bite the bullet. And now we're really glad we did it. But at the time it was like, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet either. But if you wait until you're ready, you might never do it. And so if you wait for the perfect moment, it'll never come. It'll never come. So as with any other development, our children begin to work out their racial perceptions, concepts, and ideas long before they can articulate them verbally, she says. And I thought that was really helpful. And so if we wait for our kids to bring it up, then they will have already developed strong ideas around these things, because the ideas come before the vocabulary comes. The ideas come before they can really verbalize them. So if we wait until our kids are bringing it up, then they're already going to have these really well-formed ideas. And in a sense, it's like we're too late, except that you're not, because you're never too late. But, and she gives the examples of her college students asking, why didn't anybody tell me this sooner? and feeling like they have been living a lie because they are suddenly waking up at the age of 18 or 19 to this whole world that they didn't know existed because they were living in a bubble, because they were being taught this well-intentioned teaching that failed them and comes up short. But again, if your kids are older and you're just now having this conversation, including if your kid is about to turn 40, like my mom, then it's never too late. It's never too late. And because you get to take that journey together and teaching one another with intentional, mutual conversations and learning. So don't let that be a discouraging thing. Let's see. So one of the things that she talks about that I think is really helpful, and then I'm gonna close this up, or I'm gonna go through this last bit a little bit faster. She talks about schemas, and she defines schemas as deep underlying organizational patterns through which we make sense of the world. And when it comes to race, we want the schema through which our children view the world to be one in which race is always visible to them and is just assumed by them to be something we should notice and name. And so she gives the example of her kids' schema of having two moms. Jennifer's married to another woman. They have a couple of kids, and those kids have only grown up in a house with two moms. And so it wasn't until they went to school and started meeting other kids that grew up in houses with a mom and a dad that they realized that there were other schemas out there. That's the schema that they grew up with. And that resonated with me as somebody whose children have two granddads, and that their godmothers also, it's two godmamas. And so that's part of my kids' schema, to the point where a couple of weeks ago we saw two dads with kids running around in the Lanier House front lawn, and my kids were like holding on to the fence because they were so excited to see other kids. And I saw two male friends with their respective children. But what my kids saw were two dads with their kids, because their schema is different than mine. My dad didn't come out until I was 25. And so that was not my schema growing up, but it is my kid's schema. And so this idea that we need to learn to let the language of observing physical differences roll off of our tongues and become part of the fabric of our everyday conversation, so that it is part of our kids' schema, so that it's not just this thing that pops up during, African History Month of February, like it's not just something that comes up at a certain time, but that it's part of our daily chatter, is what she calls it, our daily chatter. And I want to try to show y'all, I realized that I did this wrong this morning. I want to share a different screen with you. So let me try that real quick. And it would be here. Can I share this one? No, it's not letting me. Okay, well, oh wait, maybe it will share. Nope, let's see. How do I get it to go over? The bar that I need is in the way. There we go. Okay, here we go. Can y'all see this website now? It's Raising Race Conscious Children, and it's a resource that she mentions in her book. And this particular article, which is from 2016, so it's like 4 years old, but it is 100 race conscious things that you can say to your child to advance racial justice. And you can just scroll down and read all different kinds of things about how to address different things, like, the fact that there's predominantly white children in our children's books, or, she's talking about Doc McStuffins in one of these. It's just, and it talks about all different kinds of, it's not just talking about people with black skin, but people of all different nationalities and differences. And I think that it's important to notice in these examples that the language is specific, because while it's important for us to point out differences, if we do it in a real broad, general way, then that leads us into stereotyping people. So it's important when we talk about difference to use specific language. So thinking about the difference between saying, my doctor today was a black woman named Kathy, versus saying, women can be doctors, or black people can do anything. the first thing is a specific statement. And the second thing is a generalization. And so this gives a lot of, just examples of things that can help you kind of prime the pump of ways that you would be able to talk about race. So now I'm going to go back to my slides and share. And this last thing that I want to mention, I think is really, really, really important. And we'll be talking about it more next week too. And that is that when we talk about the importance of naming difference, it's really important to name whiteness too. Because if we don't name whiteness, then that communicates that whiteness is the norm, that whiteness is the standard. And I think about how, am I growing up reading history books in middle school, high school, the only time a person's race or gender was mentioned is if it was a person of color or a woman. Otherwise, it was just assumed that they were talking about white guys. And that's not anything that I've ever realized until I started reading this and thinking more consciously about all of the different ways that we learn things. The fact that it was only mentioned if the person was Black, or if the person was Hispanic, or if it was a woman, that was an exception to the norm, because the norm was whiteness. So it's really important for us to name whiteness too. And to that point, I'm going to show one more book. So the book that I showed you earlier is a book that addresses race head on, right? And it's important for us to have books like that because it gives us a language to talk to our children, and it gives our children a language too. But it's also really important to have books that have nothing to do with race, but just have kids being kids that are not white. So this one is The King of Kindergarten. I got it for my rising kindergartner. And it's just about this kid that's getting ready to go to kindergarten, and he's Black because whiteness is the norm in a lot of our children's books, right? And it doesn't get named. And so it's important for us to have books that have nothing to do with race, that show diversity. And that's going to be my last point for this class. So I will open it up to conversation, realizing that it's 8:57.
So you mentioned earlier that, I've grown up my whole life in Washington, D.C., which is a super diverse area. But I've noticed as we've gotten older that I feel like friend groups have kind of split. And a lot of it has been by race. And I don't know if the book talks more about that, but I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, it does talk a little bit more about that in the section that we're going to look at next, because it talks about, I'll show what's the next, we're going to talk about what do healthy white kids look like? Why do we have to call it racism, and our bodies in racial scripts? And I think that that what you're talking about really kind of is highlighted in that piece about our bodies in racial scripts. But that's a real challenge. And I think that the kind of learning we're doing here is going to help with that, but I don't think it's going to be a complete answer, because I think that there's also just this sense that that there are certain things that I'm never going to understand as a white woman, that, and this is, a white woman who lived in West Africa. And yet there are going to be things that I never understand. And so, but I'll have a lot better chance of understanding them if we're actually talking about them more, and talking about them explicitly. That's a really good question.
I looked up the article that you shared, and so I copied it and put it in the chat.
In the chat, thank you.
So that I can go back and read it later, so that y'all can go back and read it later.
Perfect. And if anybody wants to email me after this is over, I can send you the PDF of the slides and that link. I'd be happy to do that. So I'm going to close with this quote that I transcribed from a podcast that Jennifer, Dr. Harvey, was on Parenting Without Struggles, and I wanted to share it with you. You don't have to be the expert right now. You just have to show yourself as a willing, askable, engageable parent right now, and commit to then relearning some things that maybe you do need to learn. Our work as parents of white children right now is not to be perfect and not to have all the complete exact answers for our kids. Literally, our work right now is to choose to be brave. Choose to be brave and dive in and go there with them. And in the belief that by doing that, we are committing to the entire community of children in this nation who deserve a better future than what we've created to this point. I just want to encourage parents to be brave and know that you're not alone in taking on this work with your kids. And I really like that she says with your kids. We're taking this work on together. And thank y'all so much for being part of the conversation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and close this in prayer. The Lord be with you.
And
let us pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for bringing this group of people together. Thank you for giving us things to learn and people to learn with. We pray that the conversation tonight would be something that would help us to draw closer to you and to the vision that you have for this world, so that we would know the kingdom of God in its fullness. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, friends. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Bye.